Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. I am indeed honored to have been asked to do the keynote for this year's Monte Vista Crane Festival. And that honor is because I so admire the work of the Friends of the San Luis Valley National Wildlife Refuges. That's a mouthful, but they do a whole huge amount of work. So if you're not already members, I hope you will consider joining them. As I'm talking to you virtually from New Mexico today, my home, I think of other virtual connections. And I think all of us are connected not just by this one little program, but we're virtually connected to the great migration of Sandhill Cranes. In the Monte Vista area now, particularly the Rocky Mountain population of greater Sandhills are in abundance. They are the most prolific bird there at this time. And they have just left my backyard, so to speak, because I live in the middle Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, about 10 miles from Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. And that's where this Rocky Mountain population mostly overwinters. So we're connected in that way. And in extension of that, we will continue to be connected to these birds after they finish beefing up there in the Monte Vista area. They will be headed north to their nesting grounds. And so that just kind of hit me as I was thinking about our virtual connection today. And those, I should say one more thing, the Sandhill Cranes then are a part of an amazing family of birds. And so it's my pleasure today to introduce you to the cranes of the world. Now, the program is roughly divided into segments. There'll be some acknowledgements, and then I will talk in an overview of the cranes of the world and what they have in common, and interweave that to their history and biology and their cultural connections. Now, following that introduction, I will tell you briefly about the International Crane Foundation, the ICF, because you cannot talk about the cranes of the world without talking about the ICF and their work. And then will be the introduction to all 15 species of the world's cranes. And we'll end up back here in North America with the 2 species unique to our continent, the whooping crane and of course, the Sandhill Crane. So this is the symbol of the ICF, the International Crane Foundation. And I will use that symbol on a number of different illustrations and images, just to credit the library of the ICF for their most generous sharing of these materials for this program. And I also want to acknowledge at this point that I was stimulated to create this program based on my great admiration for the integrity and vision of the founders of the ICF and their current staff. It's truly an amazing organization and inspired me. Individual photographers for pictures such as this beautiful whooping crane will be acknowledged whenever I do know who they are. And I have to do a disclaimer at this point because my partner, Irv Nichols, and I, you'll see our names on a lot of the photographs, but we are not world travelers, I wished. So the pictures that we have taken of birds of international origin were taken at ICF headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Content for this program was drawn from research and conversations with crane specialists, ornithologists, historians, folklorists, a wide variety of people. It was a pleasure to be able to do that. And as I did the research, I was constantly impressed by how often veteran scientists speak not in dry facts, but with a sense of awe and wonder about these birds. For instance, the renowned naturalist and conservationist Aldo Leopold talks about cranes as trumpets in the orchestra of evolution. Trumpets in the orchestra of evolution, symbols of the sweep of millennia that underlie the daily affairs of birds and men. And scholar and ornithologist Paul Johnsgaard speaks of cranes as the stuff of magic, whose footprints have been left on the wetlands of the world for the past 60 million years or more. So you'll notice that both of these men are speaking about deep time. And that's really important, excuse me, because based on fossil evidence, cranes are indeed the oldest extant species in the world today. Now, that's not the oldest species of bird in an evolutionary sense, but cranes, particularly the Sandhill crane, is the oldest continually living species of bird. That is remarkable, because when you think about it, their history predates our own, their existence predates our own. And when hairy-backed humans first crept out of the forest onto the grassland savanna, we likely looked to cranes to learn more food resources. Cranes may have taught us, and our evolution is linked to theirs. Biologically, I also wanted to mention that we may think that cranes are more closely related to herons or egrets because of their long legs and wetland association. But the fact is they are much more related, more closely related in an evolutionary and genetic sense to rails and coots. So I think that should really give our common coot a lot more respect. Another biological fact: the tallest flying bird in the world is a crane, the Saris crane. This slate gray, pink-legged, red-headed bird stands 6 feet or more and weighs on average 18 to 20 pounds. So the Saris crane, the largest flying bird in the world. Now compare the Saris to the smallest of the cranes, the Diminutive Demoiselle, who stands 3 feet and weighs about 5 pounds. And their ranges overlap at certain points. But the Demoiselle should not be written off as a tiny little bird. This bird has incredible strength and endurance because on one of the migratory legs, hundreds of Demoiselle cross the Himalayas, the Himalayan mountains. And these birds have been observed at 30,000 feet. That's a pretty strong bird. Now, cranes then, for millennia, have been flying across this planet. And today, cranes fly across every continent with the exception of Antarctica and South America. This is a gallery of the portraits of all 15 species of the cranes. And you can see here similarities, but you can also see differences. So what is it that these birds have in common? Well, the first and most important thing is wetlands. Every species of crane is wetland dependent, wetland associated at some point in its annual life cycle. And this is an important thing to remember because the health and numbers of cranes are reflective of the health of wetlands worldwide. And that's sobering because of these 15 species, 11 are considered threatened or endangered. In addition, cranes share some physical characteristics. I think every one of them is an elegant bird, but they are generally long-legged birds with long curved necks, and all but 2 species have areas of bare skin on their heads, usually red, and that bare skin is part of their repertoire of communications. Cranes also are known for their vocalizations as well as body language. And those vocalizations for every species includes a unison call between a mated pair of cranes, a unison call that's very unique and very important in that pair bond. And cranes dance. Cranes dance enthusiastically, and they're the only family of birds that will dance year-round. So all of these things, the physical characteristics, the communication, the dancing, um, help people to identify with cranes. And over the centuries, people have readily identified with this bird family. In fact, for most of our recorded history, for instance, the dance of the white cranes was first described in 500 BCE in China. And traditionally, the Chinese have considered cranes, as well as dragons, the vehicles for those souls destined for immortality as they go to heaven. And in Japan, the wedding kimono features cranes, and that's indicative of the harmony and longevity of cranes' relationships. Because cranes, once they successfully pair, stay together year-round and for the rest of their lives. They are generally a monogamous bird. And lastly, cranes are symbolic of parental devotion. The offspring, the chick or the colts, as we call crane young, are nurtured and protected and educated within the nuclear family unit for 9 or 10 months. So all of these things talk about crane connections. And I've mentioned already the importance of longevity of cranes as a family and Sandhill cranes as a species, but they're also known for individual longevity. So I'd like to tell you about Wolf. Now, Wolf was a Siberian crane thought to have hatched in 1905 or thereabouts in a zoo in Switzerland. And there he survived 2 world wars. Well, let's fast forward to the United States in the 1970s. It became quite apparent that this was a significantly endangered species of crane. And at that time in the US, there was only one Siberian crane, and her name was Phyllis. She had lived for 30 years or more in the Philadelphia Zoo. And there she was kept in a relatively small enclosure along with waterfowl. Well, when the endangered nature of this particular species became really apparent, George Archibald, one of the co-founders of the ICF, and his staff decided to see if this bird could be bred in captivity. It had never been done before. So they arranged for Phyllis to come to ICF headquarters in Baraboo on a breeding loan. And there she was given a fairly large grassy enclosure with a little hut that she could come in and out of at her own volition. So the freedom and the other species of cranes nearby that were calling stimulated Phyllis. And it wasn't too long before she began to evidence behaviors and vocalizations indicating her interest in becoming reproductively active. Well, at that point, Dr. Archibald arranged for Wolf, who was now 71, to come to the United States also on breeding loan. And I want to talk about, in his own words, the first meeting of Phyllis and Wolf. As we lifted the plywood crate that contained Wolf and took him from the van, Phyllis began calling. Wolf answered from the crate. It was an incredibly touching moment to hear 2 birds communicating that had not heard the voice of their own species for many decades. They were placed in adjacent enclosures and immediately appeared attracted to each other. 2 weeks later, Wolf and Phyllis were moved to a shared enclosure. And that enclosure had been lined with old Christmas trees, and it was bathed in artificial light because ICF has pioneered the now well-accepted knowledge that captive breeding really relies a great deal on physical cues. And so for some birds, it might be the trees that are like the Russian taiga or 24 hours of those northern breeding ranges. And for others, it might be mist or rain or darkness or quiet, a variety of things. But let me use Dr. Archibald's words once again. I cherish the memory of watching Phyllis and Wolf late at night with their enclosure bathed in light and engaging in bursts of activity, including dancing, nest building, and long bouts of pre-copulatory calling that sometimes ended with actual copulation. Well, over time, Phyllis and Wolf produced 12 eggs. All were unfortunately infertile, but still they had proven that captive breeding was possible. So ICF continued these efforts and brought Siberian cranes on breeding loan from Japan and Germany. And 5 years after Wolf and Phyllis were first introduced, there was the first successful captive breeding of Siberian cranes. But Wolf was not done. He continued to make viable semen samples. And so at age 77, he sired 2 additional chicks through artificial insemination. And 5 years later, Wolf died. He was 82. So cranes in captivity can often live 40, 50, maybe even 60 years, but Wolf set the record at 82. Cranes in the wild otherwise rarely live beyond 25, maybe 30 years because of the greater stresses and dangers in the wild. So let me go on to one other connection of humans and cranes, not just longevity, but also in art. The oldest cave painting of a bird that is on record is dated about 6,000 years ago and found in the Tajo Seguro cave in southern Spain. This cave painting is considered to be a crane. And as hard as I've searched the internet trying to get a duplicate of that cave painting, I couldn't. So I just tell you about it against a small part of a large exhibit of student artwork that was an international ICF project. So you can imagine that cranes are a part of my life, just as they have been part of human beings' lives over the centuries. And here in the Middle Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, fall is not fall until we hear Sandhill cranes, and we often hear them far in advance of any sighting of the bird. They reassure us of nature's predictable cycles. And when they leave again in spring, late February and March, as they're going on up to the Monte Vista area, we're sad to see them go, but we relish those last cries as they kettle and move north, because their certainty reassures us that spring will come. So as much as I enjoy the cultural history of these birds, we have to move on. So let's talk briefly about the ICF. The ICF is a worldwide organization. It has a staff of more than 80 people working in concert with specialists, hundreds of specialists in over 50 countries of the world. There are 5 regional programs that you see here, the headquarters being in North America. Now, this tells you a little bit about the mission and the varied aspects of it. But I wanted to mention one more thing that they did not put on this slide, and that is that cranes are highly migratory birds, and their survival is dependent on the cooperation of people in many different countries. So ICF often acts as a catalyst, and it forges relationships of concerned individuals to work to promote the health and well-being of both cranes and of people who live nearby. So this is this dual concern for humans and cranes that really has raised my admiration for this group, and I think it's a part of their success. They're also very involved in environmental education programs around the world. And it might be, as in Africa, the creation of a true life adventure story in a native tongue to engage people, or in Southeast Asia, a hands-on educational program linking cranes and their habitat with individual people's lives. Because as a species, we tend to only protect what we come to love and understand. So here in North America, in Wisconsin, the ICF headquarters has fairly large compound. Part of it is a restoration of native Wisconsin grassland, beautiful area, but it also has two facilities. One is affectionately called Crane City, and this is the international resource for genetic diversity and a captive breeding facility. It was here that Wolf and Phyllis were first paired. It also has a very large educational public facility. And this is the only place in the world where you can see all 15 species of the world's cranes. They've undergone a huge renovation the last couple of years. Unfortunately, their grand opening had to be virtual because of the pandemic, but I am so excited to get back there because every crane species now is in a habitat representative of its native habitats. So there are paired species of each crane, there are paired cranes of each species in their own habitats. And they're generally open from May to October. So a place that's well worth visiting. Okay, drum roll, please. We are now ready to introduce you to the 15 species of cranes as individuals. So as you see again, the portraits of all of them, acknowledge that only 4 of these species are considered stable, relatively stable populations. All of the other 11 species are considered threatened or already listed as endangered in the wild, at real risk of extinction in their wild habitats. So I'm first going to start with the cranes of Africa, then I'll move to Australia, from there to Europe, Asia, and then back to North America. So as you can see, the African crane species are 4 of the most diverse and striking. 3 of these species are already listed as endangered, 1 as threatened. I'm going to start with the crowned cranes. And before I remove them in this side-by-side view, I want you to see their differences in the facial skin patterns. These are 2 separate species. The gray-crowned crane is a bird of the northern part of the African continent, the black-crowned further south. They do not interbreed, but they are they're cousins, we'll do it that way. So these particular birds are also very interesting to me because they have retained really primitive vestiges. Most cranes use their trachea or windpipe to make those booming sounds that we so associate with the sandhill. But for the crowned cranes, they have a red gullus sac, and that's what they inflate to make the booming sounds of their mating displays. Additionally, they have retained that long back toe or hallux, and that makes them the only 2 species of cranes that can still perch or roost in trees. But that's not their area of safety. They do not nest in trees, say as great blue herons. They still nest in wetlands. And wetlands are part of the reason they are endangered, because they are diminishing in Africa, partly for crops, being drained for crop production, and partly because of climate change. So the black-crowned crane, again, is the cousin of the gray-crowned and shares many of the physical characteristics. So I'm going to use the black-crowned crane to tell you a story, an African folk tale of how these birds came to have their golden headdresses. Long, long ago and far away, a king had become lost in the desert, and he grew weak and parched in the hot sunlight. He had called out to a variety of animals and birds for help, but none responded until the crane. So the cranes sheltered him under their wings and led him to safety. And as a reward for their help, the king gave all of the cranes crowns of solid gold. Well, these crowns proved to be both a curse and a blessing, because people were initially awed by the cranes with gold crowns and they revered them. But eventually people became envious and they began to kill the cranes to steal their golden crowns. Well, the king was heartsick because his benefactors were being so maltreated. So magically, he changed all of those gold crowns into shimmering golden feathers. And it's an ironic fact today for me that these golden feathers have also proved a curse as well as a blessing, because part of the endangered status of these two species is related to the fact that they are so susceptible to capture and trade on the black market. Again, humans have decided that these cranes should be theirs and their ornaments. So an interesting folk tale. Let's move on to the largest and most endangered of the African species. This is the wattled crane. And look at that partially feathered wattle. Isn't it unique? Well, it also indicates this crane's mood, because when it's excited, that wattle will elongate and the red become much more predominant. So if it's threatened or during breeding season, it can do that. And when it's at rest or if it's nervous, the wattle can retract quite further up its neck. This bird also has a rather squeaky voice as cranes go. So it's kind of a big, quiet bird. And it's endangered for mostly two things. It's very wetland dependent, the most of all the African cranes. And also biologically, it only lays one egg a season. And it has the longest incubation period for that egg, and then the longest fledging period, meaning the time that the colt is on the ground before it can fly and get better safety. So it has a very long period on the ground, and that makes it more susceptible. Now, in addition to crops and drought, a lot of rivers in Africa are being channeled and dammed for hydroelectric production. And this certainly impacts the wetlands. And it impacts not just cranes, but the people who have historically depended on the fluctuations of these rivers for their livelihoods as fishermen or farmers. So in Africa, ICF is working with many countries, and you can see here there are at least 12 nations that are part of the Wattled Crane's range. And they're working with all of these nations to, again, provide solutions for the survival of birds and people. So it's my hope for this favored bird that they will continue to be flying over the continent of Africa as millions of people struggle to meet their basic needs. So the last of the African cranes is the blue crane. And this is a crane most closely associated with South Africa. And it is not endangered, but it is considered threatened. Now, the blue crane is one of the smaller species, and it's one of the only two species that has a completely feathered head. There are no skin patches on this bird, but look at that head. Isn't it unique? It's kind of a bulbous head on a long, thin neck. And as I really enjoyed observing these birds at the ICF headquarters, and they loved their wetland, bathing in it, wading, feeding near it. They were fascinating birds to watch. Additionally, they liked to dance. And they would dance with long runs and vocalizations and big leaps. And when I discussed this with some of the ornithologists there, they said that the smaller species do dance with greater vigor than the larger species. So they're a lot of fun to watch. Okay, we will move on now to Australia and the Brolga. The Brolga is a big bird. And the Brolga is the only species that doesn't have the word crane in its common name. And that's because the Brolga were named by the Aborigines, and Brolga simply means crane. Now, Brolga is a pretty stable species. It doesn't migrate in the true sense of the word, but it does move about the continent in response to wet and rainy seasons. So the population of Brolga in northern Australia and southern New Guinea is pretty stable. But the population in Southeast Australia is of concern. Now, like all of the stable species, the Brolga has particular adaptations. One of them is a gland behind the eye that's able to secrete a concentrated salt solution. So this gland makes the Brolga able to feed in salt marshes and drink brackish water without harm to its physiology, the Brolga. On to Europe and Asia. Now, all of these cranes that are coming up next are highly migratory. So I can't pinpoint them for you to one point on the continents. So I'm going to introduce you to these cranes from the most stable populations to the absolutely most endangered of the populations. So the Brolga stable, also the Eurasian crane is a stable population. And this crane is also known as the common crane, a handsome bird. And it has shown, like the four adaptable, let me get this out. It has shown, like the other four stable species, a number of different physiologic and biologic adaptations. So let's look at the range of this bird. Huge, right? Green areas on this and all of the following maps indicate the breeding areas, and the orange indicate the overwintering areas. And you can see that the breeding areas are larger than the wintering areas, and that's because cranes are territorial during their breeding times. They spread out, but they are able to come together over the winter into larger flocks. But let's use this map to talk about one of this Eurasian crane's adaptations. If you look over to the far left at Spain, North Africa, traditionally, thousands of cranes overwintered in North Africa. But over the years, that has really decreased, and more are overwintering in Spain. And even more recently, 75, 80,000 have decided to just stay in France. Why cross the mountains to Spain? So as long as they have food resources, they will adapt their migratory routes to move north as climate change changes these northern resource availability for them. They're also showing some adaptation in their breeding grounds. Now, as I said, cranes like territories when they're in their breeding and raising their young. A Scandinavian study has shown that Eurasian cranes will often nest 10 miles apart, rarely less than 1 mile apart. But these areas are diminishing as human populations, urbanization, and industrialization increases. So there has been a coalition of concerned scientists and amateurs that have been working to do some habitat work to enable cranes to survive and nest closer to the hustle and bustle of human activity. And Eurasian cranes are adapting to that. The next of the stable European Asian populations is the Demoiselle. And as you can see, I mentioned it before as the smallest of all the cranes. And like the gray crane of Africa, it has no bare skin patches on its head. And these birds are quite adaptable. This is a brief look at their range. And you can see the arrows indicating migration in some areas go right across the Himalayas or the Himalayan mountains. And these are the cranes that have a physiological adaptation in their respiratory and circulatory system to allow that high altitude flight. And they've also shown behavioral adaptations. So the demoiselle, there was about 2,000 of them overwintering at a particular area of India, and there was a severe drought. So they needed to find some other food resources to sustain them that winter. And they did. They traveled about and they discovered corn shoots. And within 4 seasons, within just 4 seasons, those 2,000 cranes became 10,000 cranes. Cranes communicate, obviously. But that really brought them into conflict with humans because the agricultural resources of India were also very precious to human survival. So ICF has found that animal, particularly crane husbandry, takes many, many forms. So they worked closely with agronomists and agriculturalists to find a way for cranes not to do such damage to the cornfields. And this is important in the United States too, because as flocks of cranes increase in Wisconsin, in that area, they also, the sandhills love these little corn sprouts. But it was determined that cranes do not like the flavor of bitter. So a coating for seed corn has been developed that gives it a bitter flavor. And so cranes will now continue to eat the grubs and the insects, but they're not picking out and eating the individual corn shoots. So just another way that you have to think about the survival of these cranes. Now we'll move to a bird that is not stable. This bird is considered threatened and its numbers are decreasing. This is the Saris Crane, the one I introduced before as the tallest flying bird in the world. Now the Saris has a little different map of its range, but it's struggling to survive amongst the crowded peoples of India and Southeast Asia. So I will use the Saris to tell you a little bit about another project. Now, this is partially true because wetland crops like rice are giving way to dryland crops, cash crops, like soybeans and sugarcane. So many wetlands are being drained, and that's part of the reason the numbers of these birds are declining. But in Vietnam, in an area near Phu My, there is a 5,000-acre wetland, and it was considered important to this bird, but it also was under consideration to be drained for cash crops. So ICF has been working with both the scientific community, the ornithological community, and the political community of South Vietnam to come up with an alternative. And sure enough, they were able to work together to create a grant for the Khmer women of the area. And this grant was to see whether there could be another use of the wetland to increase the income of these families. And the Khmer women were already really good at weaving mats for drying rice. So they were able to adapt that ability into making handcrafts, baskets, purses, hats for the tourist trade. And sure enough, it was shown that individual, family, and village income increased, and the wetlands were preserved and the numbers of cranes increased. The Saris cranes had gone down to just an occasional sighting, but now their numbers had increased to over 50 birds, and that is 5% of the population of Southeast Asia. So a small project, but a win-win for people and cranes. Then this one, the black-necked crane, and all of the species that will follow in Europe and Asia are considered, they're listed as endangered. Now the black-necked crane, isn't it elegant? Its closest relative is actually the whooping crane, genetically. But the black-necked crane is a fascinating bird. It's very remote and it breeds at high altitudes. And it has the distinction of being the last crane species to have been identified and described by ornithologists. Its breeding is 12,000 feet. And because of that, it has a slightly stockier build, shorter limbs, wings, and legs than some of the other crane species, again, for that altitudinal adaptation. It's most closely associated with China and Bhutan. And it has a real close cultural link to Bhutan because every spring there are festivals and ceremonial gatherings, and children do a dance of the black-necked cranes to welcome these birds back to their traditional and historic breeding grounds in Bhutan. You can see they're also closely associated with China. And I want to make a note here that China is not only host to more people than any other country in the world, it's host to more crane species. A full 8 species of cranes spend some part of their year in China. So China and the interface of people and cranes will be of utmost importance to the survival of a number of species. So the black-necked crane. Next is the hooded crane. And this species also nests in remote, cold areas that are not very hospitable to humans. But it goes to winter in warmer climates. And the range map here, if you look at the Y to the left, you'll see that this crane goes down to the Yangtze River Valley, the Puhan Lake of China, and that is an area where a number of different species overwinter. It also crosses North and South Korea. Some overwinter in South Korea, but since the 50s, increasing numbers have been wintering in Japan, and there it is a revered bird. Now, this is one of the reasons that its numbers and the other birds that go to this area of Japan for the winter are increasing. This is a centralized feeding station in Izumi, and the feeding of cranes has become a very popular tourist attraction, and it also has increased the number of cranes. You can see several species in this picture, not just hooded, but you can see also how crowded the cranes become. And that's important because cranes, like we people, are susceptible to communicable diseases, particularly avian cholera and tuberculosis. And it's estimated that if a severe disease was to hit this feeding station, a full 80% of the hooded cranes would be wiped out. So there's some effort to move to satellite feeding stations rather than one concentrated one. And hopefully then that will help the survival, ensure the survival of this revered species. Elegant, beautiful bird. Next is the white-naped crane. And you're probably beginning to blur these things in your mind, but I just wanted you to get a feel for some of the unique things. Not, if you want to know individual characteristics and everything, you can go to the ICF website, but I just wanted to give you an overview of each of these species. Now, the white-naped is the only crane that has a gray and white striped neck, and it is known as a symbol of peace. It is a peace bird, a peace crane. Beautiful, elegant bird. Also has a very interesting call. Again, its range map shows some wintering at the Puyang Lake and others going across Korea. Here you'll see that a number stay at the DMZ. And many cranes that migrate across Korea stop in the DMZ area because there are many wetlands there. And that's an area where the white-naped crane spends at least a month going to its wintering area in Japan, and then another month as it goes back to its breeding area. So that's 2 months of the year. And one whole population of white-naped cranes overwinters here in the DMZ because that's what they've done for centuries. So again, another way of working to ensure the survival of cranes. Here, a very young George Archibald is shown with Kim Hon-kyu of North Korea, and they have worked together with the government to have a good portion of these wetlands made into a national monument by the Minister of Culture. And so that has given a little more security to all the cranes that come through this area. On to the red-crowned crane. Now, this crane is an iconic symbol of East Asia. Isn't it a beautiful bird? It's also known for its dancing. In fact, the dances of the red-crowned cranes are often spoken of as carefully choreographed ballets with deep bows, great fluid transmission, and great arches, some a full butterfly arch with the wings extended and the head pulled way, way back. And it fascinates me. I would love to see this dance. I have not yet, but I would love to. And it fascinates me that these ballerinas at 25 pounds are the heaviest of all the crane species. Once again, on their range map, you can see the various countries involved: Russia, the Koreas, Japan, China. And so the international collaboration for this species will be critical. And finally, the last of our Asian species and the most significantly endangered is the Siberian crane. Fascinating facial pattern of this bird. Part of its endangered status is related to its very particular requirements. It is the most aquatic of all the crane species in terms of both feeding and nesting. And also it has one of the longest migratory paths. You can see this one. There used to be other migratory paths for this bird, but now there are only about 3,000, and they are relegated to a single migratory path where they breed in northern Siberia and then go again to the Puyang Lake in China for the winter months. So it's a very long migratory journey. And you remember the anecdote of Wolf and Phyllis? Well, that's just one example of the efforts to ensure the survival of this critically endangered crane. So now we'll go back to more familiar territory. Here in North America, we have two unique species not found anywhere else in the world: the very abundant and stable Sandhill crane, and the most highly endangered of all the world's cranes, the whooping crane. I'll turn first to the whooping crane. Its decreasing numbers were gradual, but really hit a tipping point through the beginning of the 1900s. And part of its demise was because of poaching and market hunting. As we moved west, humans and the gold rush, these were large birds and they were hunted for market meat supplies. You can see that they used to have a huge historic range. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flyways that range included. And there were significant populations along the Gulf Coast. One of the full populations in Louisiana was totally wiped out by a hurricane. So they are susceptible to many things, but all of these things came together in late 1941, 42. There were only 16 whooping cranes in the wild, and they had been relegated to that single flyway, the long flyway from Canada to the Gulf Coast. There was only 16 birds. The flyway to the right of your screen is a reintroduced flyway, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a few minutes. But so we were down now to 16 birds on this flyway. There were an additional 6 in captivity. So that means a total of 22. Well, when you have that small of a population, genetic diversity becomes essential, because you cannot build a strong population without that genetic diversity. And that means captive breeding and the bringing together of different bloodlines. And so I have one last story, and this is another story involving George Archibald and the whooping crane tex. Now, this will show you the extent that ornithologists and people that believe in cranes will go to preserve genetic diversity. Now, tex had been hatched in the 1960s in the zoo in San Antonio. And because all of the other whooping crane chicks there had perished, she received a lot of hands-on special attention from her caretakers. And she grew up liking people far better than cranes. So when she became sexually mature, she would not accept another crane as her partner. And so, not wanting to lose the genetic diversity that this captive crane held, Dr. Archibald convinced them to let tex come to Baraboo, Wisconsin on a breeding loan. Always a creative thinker, he decided to see if she would form a pair bond with him, and that helping to stimulate her ovulation, and then she could be artificially inseminated. So she came to Baraboo. She was like Phyllis, given a large area with a little hut. The difference was when she first had her little cottage there, George Archibald moved a cot in, and he's lived there for a full month, getting to know tex, taking walks with her, talking with her. And sure enough, as spring came, he decided to dance with tex. And as he says, he flapped his arms and cavorted about until he was exhausted. But tex responded, and she was able to be artificially inseminated. And over the years that they did this, over 5 years that he courted and danced with tex every spring, she laid several eggs, but early on they were all infertile, or the chicks were non-viable, until finally there was a chick that had been named Gee Whiz, and he survived. It was rocky, but he survived, and he is still in ICF facilities in Baraboo. It's interesting that Gee Whiz didn't like people much, only his particular caretakers and other people. I was on a special assignment in Crane City, so I got a glimpse of tex, but in general, he did not like other people around that he was not familiar with. But he has already sired 14 additional whooping cranes, passing on tex's legacy, genetic legacy. So word of George's dancing with tex got out, and he was invited to go on to the Johnny Carson show. Well, he originally refused this, thinking or worrying that his work might be ridiculed. But eventually he decided to do it with the thought that that might help alert the nation and all of us to the plight of this highly endangered bird. So indeed, he fortified himself by writing verses of scripture and putting them in his shoes so he could stand strong. And then he took one last dance with tex on the grassy field where they had first danced 5 years before, and he took off for Los Angeles. Well, shortly after, or shortly before he went on air, about 15-20 minutes before he went on air, he received a call letting him know that a raccoon had just killed tex. The raccoon had scaled a tall fence around her enclosure and chewed through the flight netting to attack the bird. Well, can you imagine how difficult it must have been to go on air? But he did. And at the end of the interview, he recounted the tragedy. And this, I think, became tex's last gift, because the nation did respond and became more receptive to and supporting of all of the efforts to protect and bring back this endangered species. And the tragedy also highlighted the importance of having other genetically diverse groups of whooping cranes, lest some big tragedy impact that final migratory group between Canada and Texas. So the efforts to expand the breeding and range of these birds continued. And one of those efforts involved our own Rocky Mountain population of Sandhill cranes. They were enlisted as foster parents for whooping crane eggs. And the Sandhills were really good foster parents, and the whooping crane chicks and colts thrived under their care. I want to ask, I love interactive programs. I wanted to ask, have any of you seen whooping cranes on this flyway? I have in many years previously, but anyway, they are no longer here. And that's because when the whooping crane colts became sexually mature at age 5 to 7, they had obviously deeply imprinted on Sandhill cranes, and they wanted to breed with Sandhills. So that program was completely shut down. But other innovations continued because of whooping cranes' tendency to imprint on their caretakers, whether they be people or Sandhill cranes. Costumed rearing was tried. And in costumed rearing, people are never seen or heard. There's a tape of whooping crane vocalizations played as aviculturalists in costume feed and nurture these young birds. That has now been phased out because there are enough whooping cranes in captivity to again foster their own species. But for the early birds that were costumed, raised, they also had a way to make that second migratory pathway, one from Wisconsin to Florida. It was on that earlier map. And to start that flyway, they used another really unique innovation, and that's ultralight aircraft. Again, a costume pilot would lead the young birds on their first migration down to Florida. Once there, they retained that knowledge and they returned in the spring to Wisconsin. But these flights are also now being phased out, or they have been phased out, because there are enough knowledgeable whooping cranes in that second migratory route that they will accept the fostered colts and teach them the migration. So you can see how that has built over the years. And this chart shows you that from 22 total birds, there are now 826, probably more since this chart was released. So on that single major migratory path, you can see in the orange, it's gone from 16 birds to 504. And then there's an increasing group that are still in captivity and some reintroduced populations that do not migrate, particularly that Louisiana group, which is to take the place of the group lost to the hurricane. Okay, finally, to our Sandhill crane. And particularly, I think the Rocky Mountain Sandhill crane is the largest of the greater sandhills and perhaps the most elegant, but I'm partial to this bird. So of the Sandhill cranes that you're likely to see on this flight, on this migratory path here in the Monte Vista area and down where I am in New Mexico, there are 2 subspecies. There are actually 6 subspecies of Sandhill cranes, but 2 that you can really pick out in this area. In this photograph, you'll see in the background 2 adult greater Sandhill cranes and their colt. And in the foreground, you can see 2 lesser Sandhill cranes. So they're identical in appearance other than their size, but they are also widely differentiated by their ranges. So you can see the green is the breeding range of Sandhill cranes. The orange is the wintering ranges. And you can also see that they're in every single flyway in North America. But let's concentrate on the central, the mid-continent flyway. There's kind of a curved line on one side and a shorter straight arrow on the other. Okay, the straight arrow indicates the migratory path of the Rocky Mountain population of Greater Sandhills. It is a unique population and it migrates up the western side of the United States. The curved one is the migratory path for the majority of the lesser Sandhill cranes. And certainly in terms of total numbers of Sandhill cranes, the lessers are the greatest number on this continent. So the lesser Sandhill cranes will stage as they go north towards their breeding areas. They stage along the Platte River in Nebraska. And this season, there will be more than 500,000, more than 500,000 Sandhill cranes staging in this area. In fact, I leave for Nebraska in about a week or two, and I'm so excited to be able to witness this last great migration in the lower 48. It's really worth your while to see. You can actually go online at the Rose Sanctuary and look for the crane cam because you can see it on a camera, a live cam feed. The whooping cranes also come through that part of the mid-continent flyway, but because their numbers are small, of the 12 years I've worked there, I've only seen them about 5 or 6 of those years, and those are fleeting glimpses, but it's an amazing thing. But what could even be better than to witness the migration of the Rocky Mountain population of Greater Sandhill cranes against their backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. So this photograph I took at the Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge, probably last year. But they are now at the midpoint of their migration, beefing up to go further north to their breeding areas. And like all of the birds worldwide, our sandhill and whooping cranes are wetland dependent, wetland associated. And I should mention that the wetlands are important not just for cranes. They may be the most charismatic animal to get us connected to wetlands, but they're important to so many other species, the waterfowl, frogs, dragonflies. Wetlands are essential. Now, you have been a part of the crane family, and you certainly are virtually a part of the Sandhill crane migration. So I hope you will support the organizations that support these birds and their habitats. If you haven't already, join the Friends of the San Luis Valley National Wildlife Refuges. There are 3 refuges, and they support a broad variety of wildlife, including the greater Sandhill cranes of the Rocky Mountain population. And join the International Crane Foundation. In addition to helping the birds and their habitats, you will be getting a lot of interesting information to further your knowledge and connection to these bird species. But I will close with the words of another poetic naturalist and conservationist and an amazing photographer, Michael Forsberg, who reminds us that these ancient birds connect habitats and cultures and people. And I think I would extend that symbolism to their giving hope to birds, wetlands, and perhaps even humans over the planet. So thank you very much. I am delighted to have been able to be a part of your introduction to these birds. And I will turn you back over to Deb, who will tell you how I can perhaps respond to questions over time, and also tell you how you can join the Friends of the San Luis Valley National Wildlife Refuge. Thank you.